The secret to mental peace. Inner steel. The man standing at the edge of everything he built, his career, his marriage, his name, didn't break. He went silent. That silence was not weakness. That silence was the most powerful thing he had ever done. Most people think mental peace is something you stumble into. A luxury. Something you earn once life finally stops hitting you. But the men who carry the calmest minds, the ones who move through storms without flinching, they know something the rest of the world doesn't. Peace isn't a destination. It's a practice. A decision. A discipline. And what you're about to hear isn't theory. It's the product of centuries of hard-won wisdom, tested in prisons and battlefields, in boardrooms and back alleys, by men who had every reason to fall apart, and chose not to. If you've been waiting for something to sharpen your mind and settle your soul, this is it. Stay until the end. What's coming will change how you move through the world. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Inner Steel. Subscribe now, because what we build here isn't motivation. It's a way of life. Point 1. Accept what you cannot change, before it destroys what you can. There is a specific kind of suffering that only human beings inflict on themselves, and it has nothing to do with what is actually happening to them. It has everything to do with what they refuse to accept is happening. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome. He had armies at his command, the wealth of an empire at his feet, and the most educated philosophical mind of his era. He also had a son who was a fool, Commodus, who would go on to become one of history's most erratic rulers. Marcus could not change this. He could not reshape his son's character through sheer force of will. And yet, if you read his private journals, the ones he never intended anyone to see, you find no bitterness, no rage, no despair. What you find is a man who had made his peace with the unmovable. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This wasn't resignation. Marcus didn't give up on influencing his son. He didn't stop being a father. But he drew a hard line, a philosophical boundary, between what was within his control and what was not. And he refused to allow the things outside that line to poison the things inside it. Most men do the opposite. They spend enormous energy, emotional, physical, mental, raging against walls that will not move. They lose sleep over opinions they can't change, outcomes they can't reverse, people they can't control. And while they're doing that, the things they actually can shape, their habits, their responses, their trajectory, slowly fall apart from neglect. Here is the brutal truth. Most of your suffering is not caused by your circumstances. It is caused by your resistance to your circumstances. There was a man, a prisoner in a Soviet labor camp in the 1940s, who discovered this by necessity. His name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He had been a decorated officer, a man of status and intellect. Then, for the crime of writing something critical of Stalin in a private letter, he was sent to one of the most brutal prison systems in human history. Cold, starvation, forced labor, humiliation daily. He could not escape. He could not appeal. He could not change a single external fact of his existence. So he went inward. He began writing, in his mind first, memorizing thousands of lines because he had no paper. He found the one domain where no guard could reach him, his own consciousness. He decided, in the depths of a gulag, that his inner world would not be governed by his captors. And when he was finally released, he emerged not broken, but forged. He went on to write some of the most important literature of the 20th century, works that helped bring down the very system that imprisoned him. Solzhenitsyn did not accept what happened to him because he was weak. He accepted it because he understood that resisting the unchangeable wastes the energy you need to change what you can. This is where mental peace begins. not in getting everything you want, not in a life without loss or failure or injustice. It begins the moment you look at the thing that is tearing you apart and say, I cannot move this mountain, so I will stop trying to move the mountain and start learning how to build on it. The exercise is simple and difficult at once. Take what is consuming your mind right now. Write it down if you have to. Then ask 2 questions: can I change this? And if not, what am I losing by continuing to fight it? The answer to that second question is usually everything. Every man who has ever achieved lasting inner peace learned this lesson. Some learned it early. Most learned it the hard way. But no one arrived at peace without passing through acceptance first. Point 2. Master the gap between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. He watched his wife, his brother, and his parents die. He was stripped of everything: his possessions, his profession, his freedom, his identity. The Nazis even took his manuscript, the life's work he'd been carrying when they arrested him. But they could not take one thing. And Frankl knew it. He wrote about it afterward in words that should be engraved in stone. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space. That tiny gap between what happens to you and what you do about it. That is where your entire character lives. Most people have no awareness of this gap. They are reactive machines. Someone speaks harshly to them, they explode. Something goes wrong, they spiral. A plan falls apart, they collapse. The stimulus lands and the response fires automatically, like a reflex. And the tragedy is that a reflex-driven man is not actually living his life. He is being lived by it. He is a pinball, bouncing off whatever the world throws at him. The Stoics called the ability to widen this gap the discipline of the faculty of impulse, the ability to pause before acting, to interrogate the instinct before obeying it. In modern terms, we might simply call it emotional regulation. But that phrase doesn't capture the warrior-like nature of this practice. Because it takes real strength to pause when every nerve in your body is screaming to react. Consider the story of Theodore Roosevelt, a man whose natural temperament was pure fury. As a young man, he was explosive, impulsive. He charged at everything with his fists metaphorically raised. When his wife and his mother died on the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884, he wrote a single X in his diary and then threw himself into punishing physical labor in the Badlands of North Dakota for 2 years, ranching cattle, chasing outlaws, nearly killing himself with work. What Roosevelt was doing, though he would never have used this language, was learning to master the gap. He couldn't change the grief. He couldn't unfeel the rage. But he could choose where he directed the energy those feelings produced. He came back from the Badlands transformed. The man who returned was harder, calmer, more deliberate. He'd learned, through sheer physical discipline, that he was not obligated to obey his emotional impulses. That he could feel something and still choose how to respond. The men who destroy their own lives are almost always men who never learned this. They let the flash of anger send the message that burns the relationship. They let the moment of fear stop them from taking the step that would have changed everything. They let the immediate emotion overrule the long-term vision. And here is the paradox. The goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel without being governed by feeling. Frankl felt everything. He felt grief so profound it would have killed a lesser man. But he kept the gap open. He kept choosing. Even in Auschwitz, he chose what he thought about. He chose to imagine his wife's face. He chose to believe that his suffering had meaning. He chose, every single day, what meaning he would assign to what was being done to him. That is not passive endurance. That is perhaps the most active form of power a human being can exercise. To practice this, the next time something provokes you, before you speak, before you act, take 3 deliberate breaths. Not because breathing is magical, but because those 3 breaths are a physical way of forcing the gap open. They are you asserting that you are not a reflex. You are a man who chooses. Do that enough times and the gap becomes a habit. And once the gap is a habit, you are no longer at the mercy of the world. You are in command of yourself, which is the only command that actually matters. Point 3. Let go of the version of life you planned. There is a particular kind of grief that nobody talks about, the grief for the life you thought you were going to have. The career that was supposed to take off. The relationship that was supposed to last. The version of yourself at 40 that you imagined at 25. And when life departs from the plan, which it always does, many men get stuck at the departure point. They spend years, sometimes decades, haunting the ghost of the life they didn't get, comparing the present to a future that never existed. This is one of the most invisible and destructive forms of mental suffering there is. Epictetus knew something about this. He was born a slave. Not metaphorically, literally a slave, owned by a man in Rome, with no rights, no property, no sovereignty over his own body. His master once twisted his leg to test his resolve. Epictetus reportedly said calmly, "If you continue, you will break it." The master continued. The leg broke. Epictetus said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" No rage. No tears. No collapse into self-pity. Because Epictetus had long ago released the idea that his life was supposed to look any particular way. He had no plan for his life to protect. He was a slave. The plan had never been his to make. And paradoxically, that made him freer than most free men, because he had no version of life to grieve. After he was freed, he became one of the most influential philosophers in Roman history. Emperors studied under him. But he lived simply, in a small hut, owning almost nothing. Because he had learned that peace does not come from having the life you wanted. It comes from wanting the life you have. This isn't a call to passivity or low ambition. You can be a relentless builder and still hold your plans loosely. The distinction is subtle, but it is everything. Build fiercely toward what you want, but do not attach your identity or your peace to the outcome. Because outcomes are never fully yours to control. There was a Japanese concept the samurai understood called mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. The cherry blossom is beautiful partly because it falls. The samurai found peace not by denying that things end, but by fully accepting that they do. Their lives were built around this truth. They practiced death, literally, they meditated on their own death, so that impermanence could not ambush them. Modern men are ambushed constantly. Every relationship that ends. Every job that disappears. Every plan that collapses. It hits them like a shock because they never made peace with impermanence. They were sold the idea that the right life is a stable life, a predictable life, a life where your plans become your reality. That life doesn't exist for anyone. The man who has mental peace is the man who has internalized that the plan was always an approximation. A compass heading, not a train track. When the terrain changes, and it will change, he adjusts. He doesn't sit down at the crossroads and weep for the road that used to be there. Let go of the version of life you planned. Not in despair, in freedom. Because once you release it, you become available to the version of life that is actually waiting for you. And often, if you're honest, it is stranger and richer and more yours than anything you could have designed. Point 4. Silence your need for external validation. The philosopher Diogenes lived in a barrel. Literally, a large ceramic jar in the marketplace of Athens. He owned almost nothing. He rejected the social hierarchies, the political games, the theatrical displays of status that characterized Athenian life. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at the time, sought him out and asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes reportedly said, "Yes. Stand aside. You're blocking my sunlight." Alexander, to his credit, reportedly laughed and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." What Diogenes had that Alexander didn't, and Alexander conquered everything, was immunity to the opinions of others. He did not need approval. He did not need admiration. He did not need to be perceived in any particular way by any particular person. His inner life was entirely his own. Most men are living lives engineered for the approval of people who are barely thinking about them. The car they drive, the clothes they wear, the career they chose, the opinions they perform in conversation. They have spent enormous portions of their lives, often the best parts, constructing a self that others will approve of, rather than a self they actually want to be. And the cruelest irony is that it never works. Because the approval of others is the most unstable currency there is. It fluctuates daily. It depends on other people's moods, their own insecurities, their particular tastes. You can spend 20 years building something to earn respect from a crowd, and the crowd moves on. The crowd changes. The crowd forgets. But you still have to live inside your own head. Every day. For the rest of your life. There was a French philosopher and mystic of the early 20th century named Simone Weil. She was brilliant by every standard her world used to measure brilliance. Great men of her era sought her out. And yet she consistently refused positions, recognition, accolades. She turned down opportunities that would have made her famous. She worked in factories. She volunteered for dangerous missions during World War II that almost certainly contributed to her death. Why? Because she had a principle. She would not allow the gaze of others to determine the value of what she was doing. If it mattered whether or not anyone noticed. And if it didn't matter, fame couldn't make it matter. That is a level of inner freedom most people never touch. The path there isn't complicated, but it requires daily practice. Every time you notice yourself about to make a decision based on how it will look, stop. Ask instead, what do I actually want here? Not what will impress someone. Not what will earn praise. What is actually aligned with who I am and where I'm going? The more you make decisions from that place, the less power other people's opinions have over you. Not because you become cold or indifferent, but because you become rooted. A tree doesn't bend in the wind because it hates wind. It stands because its roots go deep enough. Your mental peace will be exactly as stable as your roots are deep. And roots don't grow in the soil of other people's opinions. They grow in the soil of your own clearly understood values. Build those. Defend those. And let the crowd think what it will. If this is speaking to you, you're in the right place. This is Inner Steel. Subscribe and stay close, because we're just getting started. Point 5. Stop living in the past or the future. Master the present. There is a Zen story of a monk being chased by a tiger. He runs to the edge of a cliff and grabs a vine, swinging out over the 1,000-foot drop. Above him, the tiger snarls. Below him, another tiger waits. Then he notices a wild strawberry growing on the vine. He picks it. How sweet it tasted. That story is not about recklessness. It is about the only real antidote to existential terror, the present moment. The monk cannot go up. He cannot go down. He cannot change the tigers. But he can taste the strawberry. And in that moment, that singular, immediate, real moment, there is something worth experiencing. Most men are never present. They are ghosts haunting two places that don't exist, the past and the future. The past is the country of regret. They replay old failures, old wounds, old conversations that went wrong, old decisions that can no longer be changed. They carry it all forward like dead weight, adding to it constantly, never setting it down. The future is the country of anxiety. They project forward into scenarios that may never arrive, catastrophic outcomes, unanswerable questions, threats that exist only in imagination. They torture themselves with possibilities. And while they're doing all of this, the present is happening without them. The actual life. The only life that is real. Seneca wrote with urgency about this. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And then, it is not that I'm brave, it is that I know how few of the things I feared have actually come to pass. There was an experiment done with two groups of people preparing for stressful public speeches. One group was told to focus on how anxious they felt. The other was told to focus on the details of the room they were in, the temperature, the sounds, the texture of the chair. The second group performed dramatically better. Not because they suppressed their anxiety, but because they grounded themselves in what was actually real and present. This is not mysticism. It's neuroscience. The nervous system cannot sustain high anxiety about things that are concretely present, because presence requires engagement rather than anticipation. When you are truly here, your body shifts from threat scanning to task engagement. The man who masters the present moment is not a passive man. He is not someone who ignores consequences or dismisses planning. He is someone who, when planning is done and action is required, can be fully inside the action. He brings everything he has to what is actually happening, rather than dividing himself between what happened and what might happen. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk who was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King Jr., spent decades in exile from his homeland during and after the Vietnam War. The suffering he witnessed and experienced was staggering. And yet he wrote, and spoke, and moved through the world, with a composure that seemed almost inhuman. His explanation was simple: he practiced returning. Every time his mind pulled toward grief for what was lost or fear of what was coming, he practiced returning. To his breath. To the step he was taking. To the bowl in his hands. Not because the past wasn't real and the future wasn't uncertain, but because the only place where he could actually do anything, feel anything, be anything, was here. Here. Right now. This breath. This moment. This is where mental peace lives. Not in resolution of the past. Not in certainty about the future. In the practiced, disciplined capacity to be where you actually are. Point 6. Build an inner life that doesn't need the world's permission. Most men build their sense of self on external foundations: job title, relationship status, bank account, social standing. These are not bad things to have. But they are terrible things to build your identity on. Because every single one of them can be taken. And when they go, the man whose self was built on them has nothing left to stand on. The Stoics had a term for the inner life that cannot be taken: the ruling faculty, what they called the hegemonikon. It was the command center of the self. The place from which a man governed his own thinking, his own values, his own judgments. The Stoics believed this was the only thing that was truly yours. Everything else, reputation, wealth, health, even life, was on loan. James Stockdale understood this at a cellular level. Stockdale was a U.S. Navy pilot who was shot down over Vietnam in 1965 and held as a prisoner of war for 7.5 years, 4 of which were in solitary confinement. He was tortured. He was broken physically. He had no way of knowing if he would ever be released, or if anyone in the world even knew he was alive. He held on. What kept him was not optimism. He famously said the men who didn't survive were the optimists, the ones who kept saying, "We'll be out by Christmas." And then Christmas would come and go, and they would break. What kept Stockdale was something harder and more honest, an unshakable sense of who he was, independent of his circumstances. He had read Epictetus as a young man. He applied it in a North Vietnamese prison. He knew the one thing they could not take from him was the way he interpreted what was happening. His values. His integrity. His relationship with himself. He organized the POWs. He created a code of communication. He gave men a reason to hold on. Not because he was free from fear or pain, but because his inner life was not contingent on anything external being okay. When he was released and eventually made a vice admiral, people asked him how he survived. He said, in essence, I was never confused about who I was. The circumstances were unbearable. But I was not the circumstances. That is the kind of inner life you must build. Not a fantasy self. Not a performance. But a genuine relationship with your own values, what you stand for, what you will not compromise, what you believe to be true regardless of what anyone else says. This takes work. It takes sitting with uncomfortable questions. Who am I when no one is watching? What would I refuse to do even if it cost me everything? What do I actually believe? Not what I say I believe, not what is convenient to believe, but what, in the deepest part of me, I know to be true. The man who can answer those questions clearly is a man who cannot be broken by the world. Because the world can take things from him, but it cannot take him from himself. Build that. Protect that. Return to that whenever the world tries to convince you that you are whatever is currently happening to you. You are not what is happening to you. You are how you respond to what is happening to you. Point 7. Understand that peace requires courage, not comfort. Here is the most counterintuitive truth about mental peace. You cannot find it by avoiding difficulty. You find it by going through difficulty, clearly, willingly, without flinching. Most people think peace is on the other side of all their problems being solved. If the job would stabilize, if the relationship would settle, if the money would arrive, if the uncertainty would end, then they could finally be at peace. So they wait. They endure. They postpone living until conditions improve. The conditions will not improve on the schedule you are hoping for. And even when some of them do, new ones arise. Because life is not a problem to be solved. It is a current to be navigated. The Stoics practiced voluntary hardship, deliberately subjecting themselves to discomfort so that comfort would never become a master. Cato the Younger walked barefoot through the heat of North Africa. Seneca would occasionally eat only bread and water and sleep on the floor, not as punishment, but as practice. They wanted to prove to themselves that their peace did not depend on things being pleasant. There is a man named David Goggins who understood this instinctively. He grew up in poverty, was abused, struggled with severe learning difficulties, and weighed nearly 300 pounds at his heaviest. He wanted to become a Navy SEAL. His first attempt at BUD/S failed after he broke both feet. He went back. His second attempt, he cracked his shin bone. He went back. He eventually became one of the few people to complete Navy SEAL training, Army Ranger School, and Air Force Tactical Air Controller training. What drove him was not a love of suffering. It was an understanding that on the other side of the thing he most wanted to avoid was the version of himself he most wanted to become. He called it, the governor, the mental limiter that tells you to stop when you could go further. His life's work has been pushing past that governor, not because pain is good, but because comfort at the cost of growth is its own form of suffering. And here is the key insight. The men who are most at peace are not the men who have avoided the most difficulty. They are the men who have gone through the most difficulty and found that they survived it. They have proof, earned through fire, that they can handle what comes. That proof cannot be given. It cannot be read. It cannot be thought into existence. It has to be experienced. The anxiety that plagues so many men, the low-grade, constant hum of dread about the future, is largely the anxiety of men who have never tested themselves against real difficulty, and therefore don't know what they're capable of. They don't know if they can handle it. And not knowing is more terrifying than the thing itself. The cure is not to avoid the difficulty. The cure is to walk toward it. Not recklessly. Not without preparation. But with the deliberate intention of meeting hard things, because every hard thing you meet and survive makes you less afraid of the next one. This is the paradox. The path to peace runs directly through the discomfort you've been avoiding. Not around it. Through it. The man on the other side of that discomfort is not harder or colder. He is calmer. More rooted. Less rattled by the minor turbulences that send untested men into panic. Because he knows, from evidence, that he can take it. Earn that knowledge. There is no shortcut. Point 8. Forgive, not for them, but for your own freedom. This is the point that makes the strongest men resistant. Because forgiveness has been so misrepresented, confused with condoning, confused with forgetting, confused with weakness, that many men refuse it entirely. And in refusing it, they chain themselves to the people and events they most want to be free of. Understand this clearly: forgiveness is not for the person who wronged you. It is for you. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in a South African prison for the crime of fighting apartheid. 27 years. He was confined to a tiny cell, forced to do hard labor in a lime quarry, denied visits from family, denied news from the outside world. The men who put him there stole nearly 3 decades of his life. When he was finally released, and when, impossibly, he became the first democratically elected president of South Africa, the world expected rage. The men who had imprisoned him expected retaliation. What they got instead was something that required more strength than rage: forgiveness. Not naive forgiveness. Not forgetting what had been done. Not pretending the injustice hadn't occurred. But a deliberate, chosen release of the bitterness that could have consumed him. He invited his former prison guards to his inauguration. He established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission rather than a war crimes tribunal. He spent his presidency building a country rather than settling scores. Why? He said it himself. He knew that if he carried the hatred out of prison with him, he would still be in prison. The body might be free. But the mind would still be locked in that cell, still fighting the battle, still giving the men who wronged him power over his inner life. Resentment is one of the most corrosive forces in the human psyche. It is literally the experience of reliving the wound, again and again, keeping it fresh, allowing it to continue damaging you long after the person who inflicted it has moved on with their life. You are being harmed, repeatedly, by your own memory, in service of an anger that changes nothing. This does not mean you don't defend yourself. This does not mean you allow people to wrong you without consequence. Justice and forgiveness are not the same thing, and they are not in conflict. You can hold someone accountable for what they did, legally, socially, professionally, and still release the bitterness that would otherwise consume you. The Stoics had a practice of zooming out, imagining a view of humanity from high above, seeing the smallness of individual conflicts in the vast sweep of time and human history. Seen from that altitude, most of the things that seem unforgivable reveal themselves as the predictable blunders of frightened, flawed human beings, people who were themselves damaged, operating from their own wounds. That doesn't excuse anything, but it contextualizes it. And contextualization is the first step toward release. There is someone you are carrying right now. Someone whose face appears when you least want it to. Something they did that still has a grip on your chest. And you have told yourself that forgiving them would mean they got away with it. That they won. That you are showing weakness. The truth is that as long as you carry it, they have won. Every day. Every moment their memory intrudes. Every night you lie awake with the old grievance running. They are inside your head, taking up space that belongs to your peace. Release it. Not for them. For the life you could be living if you weren't still fighting that old battle. Point 9. Choose depth over distraction. Guard your attention like your life depends on it. There is a war being fought for your mind. And most men are losing it. Every notification. Every feed. Every outrage cycle. Every endless scroll through curated content designed by algorithms to maximize your engagement, which is a polished word for anxiety, comparison, and the particular loneliness of being constantly surrounded by noise. The man who cannot sit alone with his own thoughts is a man who has been colonized. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician and philosopher, wrote something that still cuts like a blade. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He wrote that in the 1600s. Before social media. Before smartphones. Before the modern attention economy that has made distraction the default state of human existence. If it was a problem then, it is a catastrophe now. Here is what distraction actually costs you: depth. The ability to think a thought all the way through. To sit with a problem until the solution emerges. To feel an emotion without immediately medicating it with stimulation. To be alone with yourself and find that the company is actually good. These are not luxury skills. They are the foundation of everything meaningful, every great decision, every profound relationship, every creative achievement, every hard-won self-understanding, runs on the capacity for depth. And depth requires sustained attention. Sustained attention requires practice. And practice requires the willingness to be bored. Because the enemy of distraction is not stimulation. It is boredom. And most people are now so conditioned to flee boredom that they will pick up their phones between bites of food, between sentences of conversation, between sets at the gym. There was a writer named Nassim Nicholas Taleb who had a rule: no news. None. He believed, and the evidence increasingly supports him, that the daily news cycle contains almost no information that will matter to your life in any meaningful time frame, and enormous amounts of manufactured anxiety about events you cannot influence. Cutting it out, he found, gave him back thousands of hours of deep thinking time. Cal Newport, who has studied attention economies for years, describes something he calls deep work, the ability to focus on cognitively demanding tasks without distraction for extended periods. He argues, and has demonstrated through research, that this capacity is becoming increasingly rare precisely as it is becoming increasingly valuable. The men who can still do it are positioned to create work of real value. The men who can't are increasingly interchangeable. But this isn't just about productivity. It is about peace. Because the man who cannot be alone with his thoughts is at the mercy of whatever content happens to fill the silence. He has no access to his own depths. He does not know what he actually thinks, feels, wants, fears, because he has never spent enough time in quiet to find out. Start small. An hour without your phone. A walk without podcasts. A meal eaten without a screen. Sit in the silence and feel the discomfort of it, and then notice that the discomfort passes. And on the other side of it is something rare and precious, your own actual mind. That is where mental peace lives. In the depth of your own consciousness. And you cannot get there if you never stop running. Point 10. Make peace with your own mortality, and live accordingly. The ancient Stoics had a practice they called memento mori. Remember that you will die. Not as a morbid indulgence in darkness, but as the sharpest possible lens for clarifying how to live. Because the man who has genuinely reckoned with his own death sees his remaining time with completely different eyes. Seneca wrote, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. This is not pessimism. This is precision. This is the most honest accounting you can do. Steve Jobs, whatever his personal failings, said something in a 2005 Stanford commencement address that reverberated around the world. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. He had already been diagnosed with cancer when he said it. He had already looked at the fact of his own mortality directly. And what he found, on the other side of that confrontation, was not paralysis. It was extraordinary clarity. There is a Japanese tradition called ikigai, the reason for getting up in the morning, the intersection of what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. But before you can find your ikigai, you have to know what matters. And before you can know what matters, you have to confront what is finite. The man who believes he has unlimited time treats it accordingly. He postpones the conversation he needs to have. He delays the project that carries his real name. He stays in the situation that is slowly killing him because changing it feels like too much work, and there's always tomorrow. There is not always tomorrow. The Stoics would ask, if you knew this was your last day, not morbidly, but genuinely, what would you stop doing? What would you start? Who would you call? What would you put down? What would you finally pick up? Those answers are the map. That map is available to you right now. The man who has made peace with his mortality is one of the calmest men you will ever meet. Not because he doesn't value his life, precisely because he does. Every day is no longer something to get through. It is something to account for. Something to live in. Something to spend deliberately. He doesn't chase approval, because he knows time is too short for a life lived for other people's opinions. He doesn't dwell in resentment, because he knows the hours spent in bitterness are hours he will never get back. He doesn't procrastinate on the things that matter, because he has looked at the clock clearly, and he knows it is running. This is the ultimate source of mental peace. The man who has accepted that he is going to die, and has decided to live accordingly, is free from most of the traps that enslave other men. He is not chasing immortality. He is not building a monument. He is not trying to be remembered. He is trying to be fully alive, right now, and whatever time remains. That is the secret. That has always been the secret. Not a technique. Not a mindset hack. Not a morning routine or a supplement stack. A genuine reckoning. With impermanence. With mortality. With the one life you have been given and the freedom, always, despite everything, to choose how you inhabit it. Closing. This is not the end. This is a beginning. The man who lives by these principles does not arrive somewhere and sit down. He is always moving, deeper into himself, further in his understanding, more honest in his confrontation with what is real. Mental peace is not a reward you receive. It is a practice you commit to. Every day, you will be tested. Circumstances will push against everything we've talked about. People will try to disturb your stillness. The world will offer you 10,000 reasons to react rather than respond, to resist rather than accept, to look outward for what can only be found within. And every day you get to choose. That choice is everything. That choice is you. If what you heard today reached something in you, if something here rang true, then you know you're in the right place. This is inner steel. We don't do surface-level motivation. We don't do temporary highs. We build men who are rooted, clear, disciplined, and free. Subscribe to Inner Steel. Stay in this. Come back when the world knocks you sideways, because it will. And when it does, remember, your peace is not something the world gives you. It is something you forge. Now go forge it.